President Trump's sweeping tariffs against China and the subsequent retaliatory measures may just be the beginning. The president has also threatened to impose steeper tariffs elsewhere, floating the European Union, the UK, and others as possible targets. With us now, we have Wilbur Ross, former U.S. Secretary of Commerce under the first Trump administration and author of Risks and Returns, Celebrating Success in Business and Life. Secretary, great to have you on here with us. Just want to get your take specifically on the tit for tat we are seeing developing with China. Is this the start of a trade war?
I don't really think so. And the reason I don't think so is the other countries, including China, really can't afford a rapidly escalating tariff, my tariff for your tariff. And the reason for that is twofold. One, they all export much more to us than we do to them. So in absolute terms, we can do much more damage than they can do to us. And second, they're all smaller economies. So we will have both more absolute punishment and much more relative punishment than they can administer. That makes it very much a loser's game for them.
Wilbur, do you think this is the start of a new normal here under Trump? Wilbur, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Wilbur, do you think it's the start of a new normal just in terms of the strategy that we're seeing under Trump the second time around during his second presidency and the risk that this poses? Is it the right approach?
I don't think it's that risky, because the worst that will happen is we'll go back to the same trade deficits that we had before. I don't see any set of circumstances under which, even if there were some sort of temporary trade war, I don't see any set of circumstances under which we would end up worse on a trade balance point of view.
I wonder to what extent you think the administration is willing to negotiate with China specifically. We obviously saw negotiations happening with Canada and Mexico, a delay of those tariffs up to 1 month before they are enacted more seriously. But is a negotiation less likely with China, given that so many lawmakers across the aisle support a broader decoupling of the U.S. and China?
Well, I think there are several differences. First of all, China has not ever honored the original phase one that was negotiated back in the original Trump administration. So they're actually behind where they had committed to be. So I would be very surprised if he would begin negotiations unless they, as openers, began to live up to the old agreement. In contrast, both Canada and Mexico have adopted new measures dealing with border security and with the fentanyl problem. So they've already made some tangible steps. And my belief is that the waiting period, the 30-day suspension that Trump has agreed to, is really just to formalize those arrangements and to make sure they really put them into effect. But meanwhile, doing away with the de minimis exemption already will affect 66 billion at least of trade, negative trade, from all of those countries, but particularly from China. And I believe that from China, the stated value of $800 per unit or less is probably understated, because the exporters had the ability simply to self-declare the value, and there was no border inspection at all. So if anything, it's going to affect more than 66 billion, and it will disproportionately affect China because of their online retailers and the large volume that they do. The two big Chinese companies using that exemption probably account for 44 billion out of the 66 billion notional total. So he's already made a move that is very much an anti-China move without so stating.
You know, Wilbur, I'm curious how that could potentially, what that backlash then could look like. And the conversations, I believe you've been able to have some conversations with those within the White House under Trump's administration, specifically Howard Lutnick, just how you see that approach, whether it's more of a continuation of what was done under you and the first Trump administration, or whether or not that rhetoric will then quickly escalate.
Well, if you notice, the retaliation that was threatened by Canada is small relative to the amount of their exports to us that would have been affected by the 25% tariff. So that was already a demonstration that they would be very restrained and not try to accelerate a trade war. If they were interested in accelerating a trade war, they would have imposed retaliatory tariffs on more goods than, or as close to as many goods as we did, and they chose not to do that. They chose to hit a few high spots, liquor, a couple items like that, from politically sensitive states, rather than make a very big number overall. And I think that's further proof that they know that a real trade war where that we go up, they go up, we go up, they go up, it simply does not work from any of the other foreign countries' point of view.
So, Secretary, before we let you go, I want to ask you about a note from JP Morgan this week, their chief economist, saying that the totality of policies coming from the Trump administration is starting to tilt into business unfriendly territory. How true is that from where you sit when you think about the totality of policies coming from the White House thus far?
Well, by and large, the people who are saying that are the same people who, in the first Trump administration, were saying when we imposed the steel and aluminum and other tariffs, they were saying, oh, that'll be the end. It'll destroy the American car industry. It'll destroy the American pleasure boat industry. It'll destroy this and that. And they were wrong then, and they'll be wrong again. The purpose of all this fundamentally is to change corporate behavior and to encourage resourcing back from the US as opposed to the globalization that had been the big mantra of international businesses for years before. So I think behavior modification is the end result, and it's natural that particular industries that may suffer some short-term pain dislike it. But that's always going to be true.
Secretary, what about the consumer? And earlier this morning, I spoke with American Action Forum President Douglas Holtz-Eakin and asked him the biggest risk that he currently right now sees to the U.S. economy. I want to play what he told me and then get your reaction on the other side.
I think the biggest risk goes back to the tariff war. If we get into a real tit for tat with Canada, Mexico, and China, the damage to global growth is going to be significant. The damage to the United States is going to be very real. And it'll come with inflationary pressures. It'll be the worst of all worlds.
You also have well-known economist Mark Zandi taking to Twitter, taking to X, saying that he actually sees global businesses are going to become more cautious in their investment and hiring decisions. It's going to weigh on growth. You don't see any evidence or risk of that?
No, I don't think so at all. Remember, the U.S. for years and years and decades had favorable trade balances in the old days. It was only after World War II when we deliberately started making unilateral concessions to Asian and European and other companies outside the U.S. It was only then that we gradually had our trade surpluses morph into trade deficits. But we were a very strong recipient of foreign direct investment, even when we had the higher tariffs before. So there's no empirical evidence that it is correct that because we take a tougher trade policy, it will adversely affect foreign direct investment here. I don't think there's any historical or conceptual basis for that.
All right, Secretary Ross, thanks so much for taking the time to join us here this morning.